Nauru is a raised coral island in the central Pacific, 21 square kilometres of limestone and phosphate sitting alone between Australia and the equator, closer to the middle of the ocean than to any continent. It is the smallest republic on Earth, a place a man can drive around in 20 minutes and walk across in an afternoon, and for a few years in the 1970s the people who lived on it were, by some measures, the richest on the planet. The most careful academic estimate put their income per head in 1975 at around $50,000 American dollars, second in the world only to Saudi Arabia. A figure no National Accounts Office ever measured with precision, and one the island itself would soon make meaningless. On paper, in that decade, a population of a few thousand islanders held a claim to more money per person than the citizens of the United States, of Britain, of almost any industrial power then keeping proper books. It had grown that rich by selling the ground it stood on. Beneath the interior of the island, under the plateau the Nauruans called Topside, lay one of the purest deposits of phosphate rock on Earth. Fossilized seabird droppings laid down across the coral over an unmeasured span of millennia, and worth a fortune to the farmers of 2 continents who needed it for their fields. To reach it, the miners dug up the middle of the island and shipped it away, load by load, decade after decade, until roughly 4/5 of Nauru had been carried off in the holds of freighters. What they left behind was a moonscape of bare coral pinnacles, uninhabitable and unfarmable, the whole surviving population pressed onto a thin green ring of coast a few hundred meters wide. The fortune did not last. It was spent, invested badly, and shipped away as rock, until the trust fund that was meant to outlive the phosphate had fallen from more than $1 billion to a few $100 million, and then to almost nothing. Today, Nauru survives in large part on money paid to it by Australia to hold a detention centre for asylum seekers the larger country will not take, the rent on a sovereignty that has become, for practical purposes, the island's last saleable asset. This is the account of a place that dug up and sold the ground it was standing on, grew for a moment richer than anywhere else on Earth, and had almost nothing to show for it when the digging was done. Chapter 1. The Doorstop. Phosphate is not a distinguished substance, and nothing about the rock that made Nauru rich would have drawn a second glance from anyone who did not already know what it was. It is, in the case of Nauru, fossilized bird excrement, the accumulated droppings of seabirds that had roosted on the coral across a span of time no one can date, compressed over millennia into a pale, hard rock heavy with phosphorus. Phosphorus is the nutrient that most reliably limits how much a field will grow. A soil can hold water and nitrogen and still yield little if it is starved of phosphorus, and much of the farmland of Australia and New Zealand, the thin, ancient, phosphorus-poor ground of 2 settler economies staking their prosperity on wool and wheat, was starved of exactly that. Ground into superphosphate fertilizer and spread across those paddocks, Nauruan rock made grass grow where grass had struggled, an island of 21 square kilometres, carrying almost nothing a farmer could use on its own surface, held beneath it the means to fertilize the pastures of 2 continents. The deposit was found by accident, and the accident happened in an office, not on the island. In 1899, a man named Albert Ellis was working in Sydney for the Pacific Islands Company, a firm trading across the region, when his attention settled on a lump of rock that had stood in the office for years, used to prop open a door. It had been brought back from the German-administered island of Nauru sometime earlier and taken for a piece of fossilized wood, a curiosity worth keeping only for the weight of it. Ellis suspected it was something else. He had it tested, and the analysis came back as phosphate ore of the highest quality, the same material his firm was already mining at far lower grade elsewhere in the Pacific. A rock that had been holding a door open in a shipping office turned out to be a sample of one of the richest fertilizer deposits on the planet. Confirmation took 2 more years. In 1901, Ellis sailed to Nauru himself and established that the find was not a stray boulder, but the substance of the island. The central plateau, the raised interior the islanders called Topside, made up roughly 4/5 of Nauru's land, and it was, by later assay, something close to 4/5 phosphate of lime. The wealth was not a seam to be chased through rock. It was very nearly the ground itself. To mine it in full would not mean digging a pit in the island. It would mean digging up the island, plateau and all, and carrying the interior away. None of that was visible in the Sydney office in 1899, and none of it troubled the men who now understood what the doorstop had been. What they saw was a small, remote, lightly held island that happened to be made to a first approximation of money. The only questions that remained were who would take it, and on what terms, and the Nauruans, who had lived on the island long before any of it was worth a shilling to an outsider, and who owned the ground under their own customary law, were not the ones who would decide. Chapter 2. The Taking. The taking began in 1906, and for the first 60 years it was arranged so that almost none of the wealth stayed on the island. The German government, which then administered Nauru, held the mineral rights through a colonial trading concern. In 1906, those rights passed to the Pacific Phosphate Company, the firm Albert Ellis had worked for £2,000 in cash, £12,500 in company shares, and a royalty on every ton exported. Mining started that same year. The rock was blasted and dug out of the plateau, dried, and carried out to ships that could not come alongside the reef, and the island began the slow work of feeding itself load by load into the fields of the countries that owned it. The First World War changed the flag over the mine, but not the arithmetic beneath it. Germany lost the island, and in 1919 and 1920, a League of Nations mandate placed Nauru jointly under Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. The three governments created a body called the British Phosphate Commissioners to run the mine on their joint behalf, and the arrangement they built was one in which the same three countries were at once the landlord of the island, the owner of the mine, and the customer for its output. The commissioners sold Nauruan phosphate to Australian and New Zealand farmers at prices set below the world market, a subsidy in effect from the island to the agriculture of its own trustees, paid in the one thing the island had. The lower the price the commissioners charged their farmers, the less there was to share with the people whose ground was being dug up, and the price was kept low on purpose. What reached the Nauruans can be read in a short column of figures. In the first years of mining, the landowners whose ground was dug were paid something on the order of a halfpenny for every ton taken out of it. Under pressure, the rate crept upward to a penny and a half a ton in 1921 to 7.5 pence a ton in 1927. But it was measured always against a revenue the commissioners themselves had deliberately held down. By 1939, the Nauruans were receiving about 9% of the phosphate revenue, and the true proportion was smaller still because the revenue itself was a fraction of what the rock would have fetched at open market prices. The clearest single figure comes from 1948. Of some £745,000 the phosphate earned that year, the sum that reached Nauruans was £14,900, a little under 2%. The rest left on the ships. The pattern was not unique to Nauru. On Banaba, the sister phosphate island to the east, the original mining right had been bought for £50 a year, granted for 999 years. A lease that would have run into the 29th century had the rock lasted that long. Across both islands the logic was identical. The phosphate was a windfall for whoever shipped it, and a subtraction for whoever lived on top of it. For 6 decades the ground of Nauru was carried away to grow grass in other countries, and the people who owned that ground under their own law watched the plateau shrink and the ships fill and received, for their inheritance, a rate per ton that a grazier in Victoria would not have paid for gravel. That arrangement held until the islanders found a way to end it, and ending it would cost them 21 million Australian dollars and the last of their patience. Chapter 3. Independence. The man who ended it was Hammer Dirobert, a Nauruan schoolteacher who had survived one of the darker episodes of the island's war. In 1943, the Japanese occupiers had deported more than half the population to Truk in the Caroline Islands to labour for the war. Many died there, and the survivors were not brought home until January of 1946. Dirobert was among them, and when Nauru came 2 decades later to choose the date of its independence, it chose the 31st of January, the anniversary of that return. He had spent the 1960s as the leading Nauruan voice in the long negotiation over the phosphate, arguing the islanders' royalty share upward year by year. By 1960, the Nauruan portion had been raised to 22%, a figure that would have been unthinkable a decade before. The share was not enough, because a share of a rigged price is still a rigged price, and Diribert's generation had grasped that the only remedy was ownership. In June of 1967, Nauru agreed to buy the British Phosphate commissioners out of their on-island assets outright for 21 million Australian dollars, the plant, the workings, the machinery of the mine that had been draining the island for 60 years, purchased back by the people it had been draining. On the 31st of January 1968, 22 years to the day after the survivors came home from Truk, Nauru became an independent republic, the smallest in the world. Diribert was chosen to head the Governing Council on Independence Day and became the republic's first president that May. In June of 1970, the last piece fell into place when control of the mine passed fully to the locally owned Nauru Phosphate Corporation. For the first time since Albert Ellis had turned a doorstop over in his hands, the island's rock belonged to the island. The money that had been leaving in the ships for 60 years began, instead, to stay. And there was a great deal of it because independence had arrived while the deposit was still rich and the world still wanted it. Over the years from 1968 until the primary reserves ran out, Nauru would take something on the order of 43 million tons of phosphate out of its own interior and sell it into the same markets the commissioners had served at prices it now set for itself. A country of a few thousand people had taken possession of a resource worth, at the rates of the 1970s, more than it could readily spend. For a brief span, the arithmetic ran entirely in the island's favor. The rock came out at $100 million a year and more. The population that shared the proceeds numbered only a few thousand, and there was no longer a commissioner in London or a farmer in New Zealand standing between the Nauruans and the full value of their ground. What 60 years of taking had never allowed independence delivered almost overnight, a fortune undivided paid to a very small number of people. The only cost was the one nobody was yet counting, that every dollar of it came out of the island in the form of the island itself, and that the ground being sold could not be bought back at any price once it was gone. Chapter 4. The Richest People on Earth. How rich Nauru became in the 1970s is a question with no exact answer, because no one on the island was keeping the kind of national accounts that would have settled it, and the figures that survive were mostly estimated after the fact. The most careful of them was made by the economist Helen Hughes, who put Nauru's income per head in 1975 at around $50,000 American dollars, a level that, in that year, stood second in the world only to Saudi Arabia. Other accounts reach for the flat superlative and call Nauru simply the richest country on earth per head. The honest form of the claim is narrower and still remarkable. By some measures, for a few years in that decade, the people of a 21 square kilometre island held more income per person than the citizens of almost any other nation then keeping books, a distinction impossible to prove to the last decimal, and one the island would shortly render irrelevant. At independence, by Hughes's reckoning, the national assets had amounted to something like $500,000 American dollars for every man, woman, and child on Nauru. What that wealth bought in daily life was a society in which almost nothing had to be paid for. There was no income tax. Housing was provided by the state. Medical care was free, and so was schooling, including the cost of sending Nauruan students abroad to Australia for an education the island could not supply itself. Electricity, water, and the staples of an imported diet were subsidized to the point of costing next to nothing. Work for a Nauruan became largely optional. The hard labor of the mine was done increasingly by contract workers brought in from other Pacific islands and from Asia, while the phosphate revenue was distributed to the landowning population as a matter of right. A people who 3 generations earlier had been paid a half-penny a ton for their own ground now drew, without effort, one of the highest standards of living on the planet. The men governing the Republic understood, at least in principle, that the arrangement had an end. The phosphate was finite, the plateau was visibly shrinking, and a national income drawn entirely from selling off the land could not, by its own nature, outlast the land. To provide for the day the rock ran out, the government established a sovereign wealth fund, the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, and paid a share of the mining proceeds into it, so that the return on a body of invested capital might one day replace the phosphate that had built it. It was, on paper, a sound and even prudent idea to convert a wasting physical asset into a permanent financial one before the physical asset was gone. The trust would grow, over the following 2 decades, into a fund valued first in the hundreds of millions and then beyond $1 billion Australian dollars, an overseas portfolio of property and investments meant to carry the island through the century after the mining stopped. The plan depended on 2 things the island did not, in the end, possess: the discipline to spend less than it earned and the competence to invest the difference well. The revenue, at its height, ran to between 100 and 120 million Australian dollars a year, against a government whose formal budget spent a fraction of that. A surplus, in theory, large enough to build a fortune that would never end. National output would peak in 1981 and begin, from there, its long descent. But in the years around that peak, with the money arriving faster than anyone had a use for it, Nauru began to spend in ways that suggested no one seriously believed the rock would ever stop coming. The clearest monuments to that belief were a fleet of jet aircraft and a tower on another country's skyline. Chapter 5. The Jets and the Tower. The airline came first, and it was the more visible of the 2 extravagances because it moved. Nauru established a national carrier, Air Nauru, and let it grow to a size that bore no relation to the country it served. By 1983, the fleet had reached 7 Boeing jets, 2 of the larger 727s and 5 737s, flying routes across the Pacific and into Asia for a nation whose entire population would not have filled a handful of the aircraft at once. The airline lost money as a matter of course, and the losses were treated as unimportant because the purpose of it was never quite profit. It was national presence and personal convenience. The president was known to commandeer an aircraft from the schedule when he wished to travel, on one occasion taking a jet to celebrate his birthday in Majuro in the Marshall Islands, and leaving paying passengers to wait on the ground until he was finished with it. A general manager is said to have curbed the practice at last only by demanding that the president and his party pay for such flights in advance. The tower did not move, and it outlasted the jets as an emblem of the era. In Melbourne, at 80 Collins Street, the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust built itself a headquarters. Nauru House, 52 stories of glass and concrete, completed in 1977 at a cost of something over 38 million Australian dollars, and for a short while the tallest building in the city. It was called, inside the trust, the jewel in the crown, the single most valuable asset in a property empire that a Pacific island of a few thousand people had assembled on the far side of the water. A 21 square kilometre island, most of its interior already dug toward ruin, now owned the highest thing on the skyline of a mainland city 4,000 kilometres away. The middle of Nauru converted, in effect, into a skyscraper standing on someone else's ground. Nauru House was only the most conspicuous holding. The trust bought hotels across the region, in Fiji, in Auckland and Rotorua, in Guam and Manila, and towers in Hawaii, and took offices in Washington and London, until an island most of the world could not find on a map held a portfolio of real estate strung across the whole Pacific Rim. Measured only by its balance sheet, the strategy appeared to be working. The fund climbed through the 1980s toward a peak, reached around 1990, of roughly 1.3 billion Australian dollars, a sum that, set against a population still numbering only a few thousand, once again made the Nauruans, on paper, some of the wealthiest people alive. The rock was being turned into buildings, and the buildings into a fortune that would, the theory held, keep paying long after the last ton of phosphate had gone. The theory had 2 weaknesses, and both were already visible to anyone who cared to look. The first was that a great deal of what the island bought was bought badly, or minded badly, or both, so that a portfolio worth more than $1 billion on paper was worth a steadily smaller amount, in fact. The second stood in plain sight in the middle of the island, behind the airline and the tower, and the free housing and the subsidized diet. the plateau the money came out of. To pay for all of it, Nauru had been eating its own interior, and by the time the trust reached its peak, the interior was very nearly gone. 4/5 of the island reduced to a field of bare coral pinnacles, the negative shape of the fortune waiting for the day the fortune caught up with it. Chapter 6. Topside. The wealth had come out of the ground, and the ground did not close behind it. Every ton of phosphate lifted from Nauru and carried to the wheat soils of Australia and the thin pastures of New Zealand was a ton removed from the island's own interior, and to reach it the miners had first to take away everything that lay above and around it. The trees, the topsoil, the scrub, and the slow accumulation of organic matter that several thousand years of forest had laid down over the rock. None of it was put back. There was no economic reason to put it back, and no agreement anywhere in the long chain of companies and commissioners that had worked the island ever required that it be. The phosphate did not lie in a clean seam that a shaft could follow. It filled the spaces between coral pinnacles, limestone spires that the sea had left standing when the plateau rose out of it, buried for millennia under the guano rock and the soil above. To take the phosphate, the drag lines worked the plateau pocket by pocket, biting the soft grey rock out from between the pinnacles and leaving the hard coral behind. What remained when a section was worked out was not a pit and not a level floor, but a field of bare limestone spires, some the height of a man, some as tall as a 2-story house, some reaching close to 15 meters, standing over ground stripped down to the rock, with nothing growing on it and nothing able to. The Nauruans had a name for the interior plateau long before the machines reduced it to this. They called it topside, and topside was where the phosphate was, which meant topside was where the island was consumed. Section by section, decade by decade, the mining ate its way across the raised center of the island until, by the measure of every survey conducted since, roughly 4/5 of Nauru's land surface had been reduced to the same grey field of pinnacles, uninhabitable, unfarmable, holding no soil and throwing up a heat that left the interior several degrees hotter than the coast. The soil that had been carried off could not be replaced within any span of time that meant anything to the people living there. It had taken thousands of years to form, and it had been shipped abroad and spread on other countries' paddocks, and what was left could not grow it again. The people, meanwhile, had nowhere to go but the edge. The whole surviving population of the island was pressed onto the coastal fringe, a ring of habitable ground a few hundred meters wide, running between the sea on one side and the ruined plateau on the other, carrying the houses, the road, the airstrip, and every other thing the living island still required. The center was hollowed out, the rim held the people, and by around 2003 the high-grade phosphate that had made the whole arrangement possible was effectively gone, the primary reserves worked out, the mine that had run for very nearly a century falling still. The wealth and the ruin had been the same act, carried out with the same machines in the same motion. To turn 4/5 of the island into money, the island had turned 4/5 of itself into a wasteland. The only question the years after 2003 would answer was what had become of the money. Chapter 7. The money vanishes. The money had a keeper. The Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust had been built for exactly the day the phosphate ran out. A sovereign fund into which the royalties were paid so that the island would have an income after the rock was gone. By 1990, the trust was estimated to hold around 1.3 billion Australian dollars, a fortune large enough, invested with ordinary caution, to have carried a nation of a few thousand people indefinitely. It was not invested with ordinary caution. The trust's managers spread the money across the world in property and ventures that a more sober custodian would have declined. Hotels in Fiji and Hawaii and Guam, office towers, real estate held in Australia and the United States and Britain. Much of it bought near the top of a market and run afterwards at a loss. Some of it went further afield than property. In 1993, the trust put around £2 million into a West End musical, Leonardo, a stage life of Leonardo da Vinci, which opened at a London theatre in June of that year and closed roughly 5 weeks later, savaged by the critics, remembered afterwards as one of the more complete failures in the history of the London stage. The musical became the emblem of the whole squander, the single detail every account of Nauru would reach for. It deserves to be kept in proportion. £2 million on a doomed musical was a folly. It was not the wound. The wound was the hundreds of millions lost, quietly and over years, in bad property and worse loans, in a public payroll that swelled past anything the island's own production could carry, in deficits run year after year and covered by drawing down the very fund that was meant to outlast the phosphate. The trust also borrowed against itself. It took loans secured on its own assets, among them a facility from the finance arm of General Electric that ran to something over $200 million. And when the income to service the debt did not appear, the assets themselves had to be sold to cover it. The clearest measure of the collapse was Nauru House. 52 stories on Melbourne's skyline, once the tallest tower in the city, the Trust's proudest possession and the standing proof of the island's fortune. It was sold in December 2004 to pay down the debt. Bought by a Queensland investment body for around $140 million, a fraction of what the island's overseas empire had once been reckoned to be worth. The jewel was gone. Air Nauru went the same way. The national airline, which had once run 7 jets for a few thousand people, had stopped meeting its payments, and in 2005, its sole remaining Boeing was seized on the tarmac at Melbourne Airport by the American Export Bank that held the lien on it, leaving the island and its neighbour Kiribati without an air service for the better part of a year. By 2004, the trust that had held $1.3 billion Australian dollars in 1990 was estimated to hold around $300 million. Roughly $1 billion had evaporated in 14 years, spent, lost, or paid out in interest on money borrowed against what remained. A nation had been handed a fortune calculated to outlive its only resource, and had outlived the fortune instead. The phosphate was gone from the ground, and the money was gone from the fund, and the island began to look at what else it had left to sell. Chapter 8. The things for sale. What the island had left to sell was itself, not its land, which was gone, and not its rock, which was gone with it, but the legal attributes of a sovereign state. Its licenses, its registry, its passport, its borders, its seat at the table of nations. These could not be dug up, they could only be rented, and one by one they were. The first thing offered was the banking license. Nauru made itself an offshore financial haven, registering banks that existed nowhere but on paper. Several hundred of them by some counts, many sharing a single government post office box, none with an office, a vault, or a teller anywhere on the island. What passed through them did not stay on Nauru and mostly never touched it. In 1998 alone, by the estimate of a deputy chairman of the Russian Central Bank, something on the order of $70 billion of Russian money was laundered through Nauru-registered banks, a sum many times the entire fortune the island had ever earned from phosphate, moving through shell banks on a coral island that most of the account holders could not have found on a map. The arrangement did not last. In 2002, the United States formally designated Nauru a money laundering state and moved to cut its banks out of the financial system. And under that pressure, the licenses were withdrawn. Passports too. The island sold citizenship and travel documents for cash to buyers who wanted the standing of a passport without the country. A trade quietly wound up in 2003 after it emerged that some of the documents had reached men later arrested on terrorism charges in Asia. Each of these markets closed roughly as fast as it opened. Each left the island a little more compromised and no more solvent. Then Australia arrived with an offer that outlasted the others, and it arrived because of a ship. In August of 2001, a Norwegian freighter, the Tampa, pulled several hundred rescued asylum seekers out of the sea between Indonesia and Australia, and the Australian government refused to let them land on its own territory. It needed somewhere else to put them, and Nauru, broke, its fund emptied, its rock exhausted, agreed to hold them for a price. The camp that opened on the island in 2001 became the centerpiece of what Canberra called the Pacific Solution. Asylum seekers who had tried to reach Australia were shipped instead to Nauru and held there on the ruined plateau and the crowded fringe, while their claims were processed at a distance that kept them off Australian soil. The centre closed in 2008 and reopened in 2012, and across the 2 decades that followed it did what Phosphate had once done. It paid the island's bills. Australia paid Nauru well over $5 billion from 2001 onward to hold the camp, until the processing of other countries' unwanted arrivals had become the largest single source of the government's revenue. Most of what the state took in by the 2000s came from the detention of people Australia would not admit. The island that had once shipped the raw material of other nations' harvests now warehoused the people those nations turned away. It was an income, and it was steady, and it asked nothing of the land, which had nothing left to give. But it did not feed anyone. And while the island rented out its borders, a different bill was coming due inside the bodies of the people who lived there. Chapter 9. The body. The land that had been dug away was also the land that had fed people. Before the phosphate, Nauruans had lived on what a small Pacific island provides: fish taken from the reef and the deep water beyond it, pandanus and coconut, the fruit and the root crops that grew in the soil of the interior before the interior was carried off in ships. Mining took the soil, and with it took the possibility of growing food across most of the island. What remained arable was the thin coastal ring, and it was nowhere near enough to feed even a few thousand people. So the food, like everything else, was imported. And the food that came was the cheap, shipped, shelf-stable food that reaches a remote island most easily: white rice, tinned meat, tinned fish, instant noodles, sugar, and soft drink by the pallet. Traditional food had required a boat, a reef, and a garden, all of which grew harder to come by as the island's economy detached from its land. Imported food required only money, and for a while there was a great deal of money. A population that had eaten fish and root crops within living memory came, within a single generation, to eat one of the most processed diets on Earth. During the years of the fortune, this looked like abundance. It was, in the longer accounting, a slower version of the same trade the island had made with its rock, a present comfort purchased against a future ruin. The ruin arrived in the body. Rates of obesity on Nauru climbed to among the very highest recorded anywhere, and with them came diabetes on a scale that few populations on Earth have matched. By the reckoning of the international diabetes bodies, roughly a third of Nauruan adults were living with type 2 diabetes, a proportion that climbed higher still among the middle-aged, and that carried behind it the familiar train of the disease: failing kidneys, blindness, amputation, hearts giving out early. A people who had been, by some measures, the richest on Earth had become, by this measure, among the sickest. Life expectancy fell well short of the figures in the countries whose farms the island's phosphate had enriched. There was a genetic component, and the researchers who studied Nauru were careful to note it. A metabolism shaped by generations of subsistence on a lean and uncertain island food supply, suddenly meeting unlimited sugar and fat. But the mechanism that pulled the trigger was the loss of the land. The island could no longer grow its own food because it had sold the ground the food grew in, and the diet that replaced the lost harvest was the one that made the people ill. The same act that had emptied the interior had, by a longer route, reached into the bodies of the people on the rim. It was the final entry in a single ledger. The phosphate had been sold, and the interior was gone. The fortune had been spent, and the fund was gone. The sovereignty had been rented out, license by license, to whoever would pay. And now the health of the people themselves stood on the same side of the account as everything else the island had given up. What was left was the island itself, the rim where the people lived, and the ruined high ground above them. Chapter 10. The High Ground. Roughly 12,000 people live on Nauru now, on the coastal ring, in the narrow space between a rising sea and a ruined plateau. The phosphate that primary mining could reach is gone. What is dug now is the lower-grade residue scraped from between the pinnacles, a marginal business that is a shadow of the one that made the island rich. The trust fund is spent. The overseas towers are sold. The economy runs on the detention money, on fishing licenses sold to foreign tuna fleets, and on the recurring sale of the one thing a sovereign state can always offer, its recognition. In January 2024, days after an election in Taiwan, Nauru broke off relations with Taipei and recognized the government in Beijing instead, taking the aid that came with the switch. It was not the first time the island had traded its recognition. it had crossed between the two governments before, moving each time toward whichever offered more. A vote at the United Nations, a seat, a signature on a diplomatic register, these had become assets to be realized, the way Nauru House had once been an asset to be sold. And having sold the land and rented the sovereignty, the island placed a second bet on a second resource, this one under the sea. Nauru became the sponsoring state for a company seeking to mine the deep ocean floor, backing a venture to lift metal-bearing nodules from the seabed thousands of kilometers away in the Pacific, and using its standing as a small sovereign nation to press the international authority that governs the seabed to open that ground to mining before the rules for doing so had been agreed. The bet was the same bet the island had made in 1906, and again with its trust fund, and again with its banks, that a single resource sold to distant buyers would carry a nation that had run out of other options. The seabed was untested, the venture contested, the outcome unknown. It was, once more, everything staked on rock. There was one more turn, and it was the coldest of them all. The sea around Nauru is rising faster than the global average, and the salt is working into the thin coastal ring where the whole population lives. The only high ground on the island, the only land that sits well above the reach of the water, is topside. The mined-out interior, the 4/5 of Nauru that was dug away and shipped abroad. The plan now taking shape is to move the people up onto it, to build the island's future on the very ground its past was carried off from. The high ground the islanders mined to make themselves rich is the high ground they may have to retreat onto to survive. Stand at the edge of topside today, and the view is the same in every direction. Grey coral pinnacles run out to the horizon, spire after spire of bare limestone, standing where the soil and the guano rock used to be. The ground between them stripped down to the rock, nothing growing, the heat coming up off the stone. Each pinnacle marks the space where a pocket of phosphate was cut out and carried down to the coast and poured into a ship. The field of them is the exact shape of the wealth, the negative image of a fortune, taken out one pocket at a time and sailed away over the reef to fertilize other countries' fields. It is all still there, the whole record of it, standing in the middle of the island, the ground the people sold, waiting for the people to climb back up and stand on it.